The world as they knew it had ended. The infected were everywhere, ravaging cities and leaving nothing but desolation in their wake. Survivors huddled in the remnants of shelters, trying to stay out of sight, hoping for a miracle. Among them, a small group of scientists and ex-military personnel remained hidden in an underground facility, cut off from the rest of the world. They had one singular goal: uncover the truth about the infection and find a cure. Dr. Evelyn Carter, a virologist, paced back and forth in the dimly lit lab. Her hands trembled as she stared at the data on the screens before her. The virus, the cause of the plague that had wiped out most of humanity, had been studied relentlessly. But for months, every theory they tested only led to dead ends. Now, though, they had something new, something they hadn't expected. "What's our status on the virus mutation?" Dr. Carter asked, turning toward the team. Lieutenant Mark Thomas, a former military strategist, stood nearby, eyeing the screens. "We've detected a change, Doctor. The infected aren't acting the way they used to. It's subtle, but it's there." Carter leaned closer to the screen, trying to make sense of the data. The mutation was strange, almost too precise to be random. It was as if the virus was evolving, adapting. The infected, who had once been mindless and aggressive, were beginning to exhibit signs of intelligence. This was something the world hadn't seen before. A terrifying development. "We might be looking at something far worse than we thought," Carter muttered under her breath. Thomas exchanged a glance with her. "You think it's going to get worse?" "It's already bad enough." "I'm not talking about just the infected getting smarter," Carter replied. "The virus. It's not just a biological weapon anymore. It's learning, evolving. If we don't find a way to stop it, the infected will surpass anything we can imagine." The weight of her words settled on the team. They had always been on the defensive, focusing on survival rather than trying to understand the infection. But now, they had to face a horrifying reality: the infected were evolving into something far more dangerous. Outside the lab, the atmosphere was tense. The survivors had been waiting for months for some kind of hope, but now that hope seemed more like a distant dream. The growing infection didn't just threaten their lives, it threatened everything they had fought for. Inside the underground facility, Carter's team wasn't just working for survival anymore. They were racing against time to unlock the secrets of the virus and find something that could reverse the damage. Every test they ran brought new information, but also more questions. "What's this?" Dr. Carter said, leaning closer to another screen. A new batch of data had just come in. This wasn't from the infected bodies they had been studying, but something else entirely, a strange anomaly. One of her colleagues, Dr. Laura Mendez, tapped the screen and zoomed in. "This could be it. This could be the answer we've been looking for." The data was inconclusive, but it showed a pattern. The virus appeared to have created a resistance, something that could potentially counteract its own effects. A cure? Or a weapon? The discovery raised more questions than answers. But there was no time to waste. "We need to send a team out to retrieve more samples," Carter said, her voice filled with urgency. "If this works, it could be the key to ending this nightmare." Thomas shook his head. "Sending a team out now? It's too dangerous. The infected are evolving too fast. We can't afford to lose more people." Carter's gaze hardened. She knew the risks, but there was no other choice. If they didn't act, they might never get another chance. "We don't have a choice," she insisted. "If we wait too long, we won't have anything left to save." But the decision wasn't hers alone to make. The rest of the survivors in the facility had to be convinced. If they were going to risk their lives, they needed to know that there was hope, that this new discovery could truly save them. The tension in the air thickened as Carter and Thomas headed to the meeting room. They knew what was at stake, but the others wouldn't understand the urgency. The infected were evolving, and with each passing day, they were becoming more deadly. Time was running out. As they entered the room, Carter could see the fear in the eyes of the survivors. They were tired, worn down by months of hiding, scavenging, and fighting for survival. But the discovery Carter held in her hands might be the only chance they had. The question was simple: would they be willing to risk everything for a shot at salvation? The fate of humanity rested on a single decision. And as the group listened to Carter's explanation, they knew the battle for their lives, and for the world, was far from over. Let me know if you'd like me to continue with the next part. The room fell silent as Dr. Carter finished speaking. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. The survivors, a mixture of civilians and soldiers, exchanged uneasy glances. Some seemed willing to take the risk, others, particularly those who had lost loved ones to the infected, weren't so sure. "We're talking about sending a team into the heart of the infection," Lieutenant Thomas said, his voice low but firm. "That's a suicide mission, Doctor. We've lost enough people already." Carter's eyes narrowed. She understood the fear, she felt it too. But she couldn't afford to let it cloud her judgment. If they didn't act now, the mutation would get worse, and they would lose any chance of turning the tide. "I'm not asking you to send them into the heart of the infection without a plan," Carter replied, her tone resolute. "We've been working on a prototype weapon, something that could temporarily neutralize the infected. It's not perfect, but it could give our team the opening they need to get in and get the samples we need." Thomas leaned against the table, still skeptical. "And you expect us to believe that this prototype can actually work? The infected are getting faster, stronger. We've seen them outmaneuver our best soldiers. How do we know this won't make things worse?" Dr. Mendez, who had been quiet up until now, spoke up. "We've seen what happens when the infected mutate. We can't just sit here and wait for the virus to evolve further. If we don't try, we're as good as dead anyway." Mendez's words seemed to shift something in the room. Slowly, one by one, the others began to nod. The reality was clear: they were running out of time. The infected were changing faster than anyone could predict, and if they didn't act now, they might never have another opportunity. After what felt like an eternity of tense silence, Captain Rios, one of the remaining military leaders, finally stood up. His face was grim, but there was determination in his eyes. "I'll lead the team. We'll go in and retrieve those samples. We'll get the data you need, Dr. Carter, no matter the cost." Carter's heart sank, but she nodded. She knew Rios was one of the best, but even he couldn't guarantee their survival. Still, she had no other choice. This was their only shot. "We'll need to move quickly," Carter said, pulling up a map of the area surrounding the facility on the holographic screen. "The infected have spread out, but we've identified a relatively safe route. It'll take us near the old medical research labs, which is where we believe the mutation originated." The team gathered around the screen, studying the map. Carter pointed to a location about 10 miles out from their position. "This is where the samples are. If we can get there before the mutation progresses further, we may have a chance to synthesize an antidote." Thomas walked over, studying the map. "It's a straight shot, but the infected are swarming the area. Even with the prototype weapon, getting close will be a nightmare. It's not just about retrieving the samples, it's about surviving long enough to get back." Carter felt a knot form in her stomach. The fear was starting to creep in, but she pushed it down. She had no room for doubt. "Not now. We'll send a small team. They'll be equipped with the prototype, and we'll have backup ready to go in case things go south. I'll be overseeing from here, making adjustments if needed." The survivors exchanged glances. The weight of the decision was clear, but there was no turning back now. They were all in this together. Captain Rios turned to his team. "Get ready. We leave at first light." Later that evening, the group gathered in the underground bunker. Everyone knew the mission was dangerous, but they also knew the stakes. This wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about saving what was left of humanity. Carter couldn't help but think of the world before the infection, the world that now seemed like a distant memory. As the team made their final preparations, Carter pulled Lieutenant Thomas aside. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice quiet. Thomas looked at her, his eyes hard but not without a trace of concern. "I don't have much of a choice, do I? You're right. We need to try. Carter nodded, but her mind was filled with doubts. Was this truly the answer? Was the prototype weapon enough to hold off the mutated infected? What if it failed? Before she could voice any of her fears, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. It was time. The team was ready. Captain Rios's voice rang out, steady and calm. We're moving out. Stay sharp, everyone. Carter took a deep breath, steeling herself. The plan was in motion, and all they could do now was hope that it would work. The world was depending on them, and on the discovery they had just made. This was their only chance to stop the infection from evolving into something they couldn't defeat. As the team disappeared into the shadows, the faint sound of the surface doors closing behind them, Carter watched with a heavy heart. The future was uncertain, but the truth about the infection was out there, and it was their last hope for survival. Let me know if you'd like me to continue with the next part. The sky above the city was a dull gray, a reflection of the bleak world below. The survivors had taken every precaution before embarking on the mission, but nothing could fully prepare them for the horrors they were about to face. As Captain Rios led his team through the crumbling streets, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Every shadow could hide a threat, every gust of wind could carry the faintest sound of the infected, lurking just out of sight. Rios glanced at his team, making sure they were in position. Lieutenant Thomas walked alongside him, gripping his weapon tightly. The rest of the team, armed with the prototype weapon designed to neutralize the infected, kept a steady pace, their eyes scanning the surroundings. The weight of their mission was clear: they had to retrieve the samples, and they had to survive. This is our route, Rios said, pointing toward a narrow alley that led toward their objective. Stick to the plan. We can't afford to waste time. The team nodded, their faces set in grim determination. There was no room for fear, not now. As they moved through the desolate streets, the familiar sounds of the world before the infection were replaced by the eerie silence of a city in ruins. The wind howled through broken windows, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. Every step they took seemed to echo, louder than it should be, but it wasn't the sound they feared, it was what might be listening. Stay alert, Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. The infected are getting smarter. They could be tracking us. Rios didn't need to be told. They had all seen it, the infected moving with more purpose, more coordination. At first, it had been the mindless, bloodthirsty mobs. But now, they had evolved. Some moved in packs, while others worked alone, more calculated than before. It was only a matter of time before they encountered one of them. The alley opened up to a wide street, the path to the medical research labs just ahead. But something felt off. Rios held up his hand, signaling the team to stop. Listen, he said, his voice tense. The wind had died down, and for a moment, everything was eerily quiet. It was the kind of silence that felt wrong. Thomas's eyes narrowed, scanning the area. I don't like this. It's too quiet. The team exchanged nervous glances. They were nearing the heart of the infection zone, and it seemed almost too calm. It was as if the infected were waiting for them, biding their time. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the silence. Rios's heart raced. He knew that sound. The growl of a mutated infected, smarter, faster, more dangerous than anything they had encountered before. We've got company, Rios muttered, his hand instinctively going to his weapon. In an instant, the atmosphere shifted from uneasy calm to full-blown chaos. Figures appeared from the shadows, infected, but not like the mindless creatures they had seen before. These were different. Their movements were swift, coordinated, and disturbingly intelligent. Move! Rios shouted. The team didn't hesitate. They scattered, diving for cover as the first wave of infected closed in. The prototype weapon crackled to life, sending out waves of energy that momentarily stunned the attackers. But it was only temporary. Stay close. Rios barked, scanning the area. We need to get to the labs. The infected were relentless, but the team was ready. They fired at the oncoming horde, using the prototype to slow them down, but the energy wasn't enough to stop them for long. The creatures began to adapt, learning to avoid the blasts and working together to outflank the survivors. "This is insane," Thomas shouted over the noise of the chaos. "They're evolving faster than we can react." Rios didn't have time to answer. The team had reached the entrance to the labs, but it was locked, a rusted steel door blocking their way. The infected were closing in, and the team had no time to waste. "Get the door open," Rios ordered. Mendez, one of the team's engineers, rushed to the door, pulling out tools to override the lock. The tension was palpable, every second felt like an eternity. The infected were almost upon them now, their growls growing louder, their faces twisted in grotesque snarls. Finally, with a loud click, the door swung open. Rios shoved Mendez inside, followed by Thomas and the rest of the team. As the last person entered, Rios slammed the door shut, locking it behind them. The group stood in the darkened lab, panting and covered in sweat. The sound of the infected pounding against the door was deafening, but for the moment, they were safe. "That was too close," Thomas muttered, wiping his forehead. "How long can we hold them off?" Rios scanned the room. The lab was filled with outdated equipment, but they didn't have the luxury of time to worry about that now. "We don't have long. We need to find the samples and get out before they break through." Carter's words echoed in his mind, "If we don't act now, we may never get another chance." "Let's move," Rios said, his voice steady despite the chaos outside. "Find the samples and secure them. We're getting out of here, no matter what." The team split up, moving through the dark hallways of the lab, each step heavy with the knowledge that time was running out. They had come this far, but would they make it out alive? The infected were evolving. And soon, the world might never be the same again. The team moved quickly through the labyrinthine corridors of the medical research lab, their footsteps echoing off the cold, concrete walls. The tension was palpable, every minute feeling like an eternity. Rios led the way, his hand gripping the prototype weapon tightly, his senses on high alert. He knew the infected were close, he could hear the pounding on the steel door they had just sealed. It wouldn't be long before they breached it. "Keep your eyes peeled," Rios instructed, his voice low and steady. "The samples are somewhere in this wing. We don't have time to waste." Mendez, the team's engineer, was already scanning the walls for any signs of the lab's security system. "I'll find the terminal," he said, his fingers flying over the control panel as he tried to access the building's old, outdated systems. "Once I have access, we'll know exactly where the samples are stored." Thomas, his weapon raised, stood guard by the doorway, his eyes scanning the hallway for movement. "We need to hurry. The infected won't wait much longer." Rios nodded, but his mind was already working on a backup plan. If they didn't find the samples soon, they'd have to fight their way out. It was a risk, but the stakes were too high. They needed those samples, no matter what it took. The room was dark, lit only by the flickering emergency lights that lined the ceiling. It felt as though the lab had been abandoned for years, a tomb for the research that had once been conducted here. Rios tried to push aside the creeping feeling of dread that washed over him as he thought about the people who had worked here, the scientists, the researchers, who had started the experiments that led to the outbreak. "We're in," Mendez said suddenly, his voice breaking through Rios's thoughts. The engineer turned to the team, his eyes sharp. "The samples are stored in the central vault, but it's heavily secured. We'll need to override a few layers of security before we can access it." "Do what you have to," Rios said, his voice tight with urgency. "We don't have much time." Mendez quickly began working, his fingers moving with practiced precision as he bypassed the lab's systems. Meanwhile, Thomas and Rios kept watch, every nerve on edge. The door to the lab continued to shake, the infected on the other side growing more frantic as time passed. Their growls were constant, echoing in the background like a haunting reminder of how close they were to being overwhelmed. "Found it," Mendez said, his voice triumphant. The screen in front of him flickered as the vault door's security system was bypassed. "I've unlocked the central vault. We're in." Rios didn't wait for further instructions. He motioned for Mendez to lead the way, and the team followed closely behind. They moved quickly, rounding a corner into the central lab area. The vault was ahead, its imposing metal door stood like a fortress, waiting to be opened. As Mendez approached the terminal, he glanced over his shoulder. "Stay sharp. We don't know how long this will take." Rios positioned himself next to the vault door, scanning the area for any sign of the infected. There were no more growls, but that didn't mean they were gone. The silence now was just as dangerous. The infected were adaptive, sneaky. They could be waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Mendez punched in the final code, and the heavy metal door to the vault slowly creaked open. The air inside the vault was musty, filled with the smell of old equipment and long-forgotten research. Shelves lined the walls, filled with vials, files, and various lab instruments. At the center of the room, a glass container held the key to their survival, the samples they needed. "That's it," Mendez said, his eyes wide as he rushed forward to retrieve the container. "This is what we came for." As Mendez reached out to grab the vial, a loud crash sounded from behind them. The steel door to the lab shattered, splintering under the weight of the infected's relentless assault. In the blink of an eye, a wave of the creatures poured through, their glowing eyes locked onto the survivors with predatory hunger. "Move! Get to the exit!" Rios yelled, grabbing the vial from Mendez's hands and shoving him toward the door. The team scrambled to regroup, the infected already flooding the room. Thomas fired a burst from his weapon, temporarily stunning the attackers, but it was only a brief delay. They were outnumbered. They needed to leave, now. "Go! Go!" Rios shouted, urging the team forward. They sprinted through the lab's corridors, the sounds of the infected closing in behind them. The vault's opening had triggered the alarms, and now every infected in the area knew where they were. Rios's heart pounded in his chest as he pushed the team forward, not daring to look back. Mendez, still clutching the vial, was barely keeping up. "We can't outrun them forever." "We don't need to outrun them," Rios replied, his eyes scanning the hallway. "We just need to reach the exit." They rounded a corner and came face to face with a wall of infected. The creatures were everywhere, their twisted forms filling the corridor. Rios's mind raced as he quickly assessed the situation. There was no way around them. "Prototype weapon!" Rios barked. Thomas wasted no time. He stepped forward and activated the weapon, sending out a pulse of energy that stunned the nearest group of infected. They staggered backward, momentarily disoriented, giving the team just enough space to fight their way through. Rios led the charge, clearing a path as they fought their way toward the exit. The infected were relentless, but they couldn't let them stop them now. Not when they were so close. With one final push, they reached the exit. Rios slammed the door behind them, and the team stumbled into the street, gasping for breath. The city was eerily quiet, the infected temporarily held off by their escape. But the real battle was just beginning. They had the samples, but could they make it back alive? Let me know if you'd like me to continue with the next part. The team stood in the deserted street, catching their breath as the adrenaline from their narrow escape began to fade. The city was silent again, but the weight of the moment pressed down on them. They had the samples, the key to a possible cure, but they were far from safe. The infected were everywhere, and their escape had only bought them a brief respite. Rios wiped sweat from his brow and looked around. The city had once been bustling with life, a place of commerce, culture, and hope. Now, it was a haunting shell of its former self. Buildings were crumbling, streets were overrun with debris, and the air smelled faintly of decay. The infection had claimed everything. "We need to move," Rios said, his voice steady despite the chaos still brewing in his mind. "We've got the samples, but we need to get out of here before more of them show up." Thomas looked at the skyline in the distance. "There's a safe zone to the north. We should head there, try to make contact with the resistance. It's our best shot." Rios nodded. The resistance had been a faint hope for many, a rumor that a group of survivors had found a way to fight back. But Rios wasn't sure if they were real or just a myth. Still, they had to try. It was the only lead they had. "Let's move out," Rios ordered, pulling the team into formation. Mendez, still holding the vial of samples, moved quickly to keep up. His face was pale, but his grip on the vial was firm. It was their lifeline. The group set off, sticking to the alleys and side streets, trying to avoid the main roads where the infected roamed freely. Every turn they made, every alley they ducked into, felt like a gamble. The infected were unpredictable, and the more they fought, the smarter they seemed to get. "We need a plan," Thomas muttered as they moved. "We can't just keep running forever." Rios was already thinking several steps ahead. "We need to use the prototype weapon more strategically. We can't waste energy on small groups. The real threat is when they gather in large numbers." "We need more firepower," Mendez added, looking at the prototype in his hands. "The weapon's effective, but it's not enough to hold off a large horde. We need to get to the resistance and figure out how to make it more powerful." Rios knew Mendez was right. The prototype had potential, but it was still in its early stages. If they were going to survive, they needed to find a way to upgrade it, to turn it into something that could take on the growing tide of infected. "I agree," Rios said. "Once we get to the safe zone, we'll assess our options. But for now, we keep moving." They continued their trek through the city, taking a winding route to avoid any major infected clusters. Despite the constant threat, there was a grim sense of focus among the group. They knew they had to push forward. There was no turning back now. Hours passed as they moved cautiously through the abandoned city, the weight of the mission pressing heavily on their shoulders. The streets were eerily quiet, and the only sound was the distant groaning of the infected. It was like the calm before the storm, and Rios knew it wouldn't last long. As they turned another corner, Rios froze. He motioned for the team to stop and listen. The unmistakable sound of infected growls reached his ears, and his heart skipped a beat. "They're here," Rios whispered. The team immediately crouched down, trying to hide in the shadows. Rios glanced around, searching for a way out. The alley they were in was too narrow for a full-on fight, and there was no time to backtrack. "We can't stay here," Thomas said, his voice tense. "We need to find cover, now." Rios nodded, signaling the team to move. They crept through the alley, sticking close to the walls, hoping to avoid detection. But as they reached the end of the alley, a sound that made Rios's blood run cold echoed behind them. The infected were closing in, their growls growing louder. "Run!" Rios shouted. The team sprinted down the street, trying to put as much distance between themselves and the horde as possible. They turned a corner, but the sound of pounding feet followed them, the infected chasing with unnatural speed. Rios looked back just in time to see a group of them emerging from the shadows, their eyes glowing with hunger. "Split up," he commanded. The team scattered, each member taking a different route to confuse the infected. It was a risky move, but they had no choice. Rios's heart raced as he took off down a side street, glancing over his shoulder to make sure the others were still with him. But the infected were closing in faster than he had anticipated. The streets were too narrow for them to outrun them for long. As he turned another corner, Rios collided with someone who wasn't one of his team. "Watch out," a voice shouted. It was a man, disheveled and covered in dirt, his eyes wide with fear. He was holding a gun, but it was shaking in his hands. "Who are you?" Rios demanded, instinctively pulling his weapon. The man's voice cracked as he looked past Rios and saw the infected approaching. "I'm just trying to survive. You have to help me." Rios hesitated for a moment. There was no time to waste on strangers. But the man's fear was genuine, and if they didn't help him, he wouldn't make it. "Get behind me," Rios ordered. The man complied, stepping back as Rios turned to face the oncoming horde. His heart pounded, but he knew what needed to be done. He had to protect his team. They didn't have the luxury of time. "Move!" Rios yelled to his team, who had now regrouped. They needed to push through the infected. There was no other choice. "Let me know if you'd like me to continue." The infected were closing in, their grotesque forms lurching forward with terrifying speed. Rios knew that they didn't have much time. The small alleyway they had found themselves in was too narrow to maneuver freely, and the infected were relentless. They could hear the raspy breaths, the wet snarls that signaled the creatures were only moments away from pouncing. Rios took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He scanned the environment, quickly assessing their options. There were dumpsters on either side of the alley, and the buildings around them were old, dilapidated. He could hear the distant sound of footsteps from the other direction. The last thing they needed was to be trapped from both sides. "Stay close, and keep moving," Rios shouted, turning to the man they had helped. "You better keep up or you're on your own." The stranger nodded, clearly terrified, but nodded nonetheless. He had no choice now but to trust them. They had to get to the safe zone, and if they didn't, the city would be their tomb. The infected were closer now, their slow but unyielding march almost unbearable in the silence. Rios heard the clicking of nails against concrete as the creatures prowled, searching for their prey. It wasn't just the noise that sent a chill down his spine, it was the dead, soulless eyes staring back at him, as if they could see right through him. "Keep low," Rios ordered, his voice steady but sharp. "They can't hear us if we move quietly." Thomas took point, signaling for Mendez and the stranger to follow closely. Rios fell in line behind them, his hand gripping the prototype weapon, ready to use it if the infected got too close. They continued to move slowly, weaving through the wreckage of abandoned cars and broken streetlights. The infected were just around the corner now. The stench of decay was overpowering, and the air grew heavier with every passing second. Without warning, the first infected lunged out from behind a dumpster, its rotting body crashing into a pile of old tires. The group froze. "Not good," Thomas muttered, lifting his weapon, but Rios waved him off. "Let them pass," Rios whispered, motioning to the others to hold back. The infected were too close to risk a fight, especially in such tight quarters. The group pressed against the walls, hearts pounding in their chests as the infected shambled by, oblivious to their presence. Rios barely breathed, each second feeling like an eternity as he prayed the creatures wouldn't catch their scent. After what seemed like an age, the last of the infected passed, its grotesque form dragging its feet in an unnatural, jerky motion. The team waited in tense silence, the sound of the infected's growls gradually fading into the distance. Once they were sure it was safe, Rios nodded. "Move. Now." The team quickly got back on the move, but the threat wasn't over. The horde was still out there, and they were drawing closer. The safe zone to the north seemed like a distant dream, and Rios couldn't help but feel the weight of their mission bearing down on him. They rounded another corner, but this time, they didn't encounter a horde of infected. Instead, they found a group of survivors, disheveled, dirty, and armed. It was an ambush. "Hands up," a man barked from the group, pointing a rifle at Rios. "What are you doing here?" Rios froze, trying to gauge the situation. The group had the look of people who had seen too much, and they were clearly desperate. But they were also armed, and Rios couldn't afford to make any wrong moves. "We're just trying to get to the safe zone," Rios said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We've got the samples that could end this, could help everyone." The leader of the group, a burly man with a scar across his face, sneered. "Samples? What's to say you're not just another group trying to take what we've got?" Mendez stepped forward, the vial in his hand. "We've got something here that can stop the infection. It's not a lie." The leader's eyes flickered with interest, but his suspicion remained. "Prove it." Rios stepped forward, eyes hard. "We don't have time for this. You want proof? Help us get out of here, and you'll see what we can do." For a tense moment, the two groups stared each other down. Then, the leader seemed to make a decision. He lowered his rifle slightly, but kept it trained on Rios. "Fine. But you better not be lying. You lead the way. We'll cover your back." Rios didn't hesitate. "Deal." With the new group in tow, they made their way north, sticking to smaller streets and alleyways to avoid the larger groups of infected. The tension in the air was thick, and every noise felt amplified, every shadow threatening to conceal a new danger. As they pushed forward, Rios's thoughts were clouded. He couldn't help but wonder if they had made a mistake by trusting these survivors. In the world they were living in, trust was a rare and fragile thing. Betrayal was always just one bad decision away. But as they drew closer to the safe zone, Rios allowed himself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, they had a chance at saving everyone. If they could get to the resistance, if they could figure out how to use the samples, maybe the nightmare would finally end. But the infected were never far behind, and time was running out. Let me know if you'd like me to continue with the next part. The journey had been arduous, and the closer they got to the supposed safe zone, the more Rios felt the gnawing uncertainty settle in. Despite their newfound allies, the tension within the group was palpable. Trust could only go so far in a world like this, and the group of survivors they had encountered earlier seemed more than willing to hold their end of the bargain, at least for now. Rios led the way, keeping his eyes sharp, his mind constantly calculating their next move. The infected were not their only threat. These survivors, while useful for the moment, could turn on them at any given time. If there was one thing Rios had learned, it was that people were just as dangerous as the infected when pushed to the edge. "I don't like it," Thomas said, breaking the silence. "Something's off about this whole situation. We've been walking for hours, and the closer we get, the fewer infected we see." Rios glanced back at Thomas, considering his words. "Yeah, it's strange. It's almost too quiet." Mendez, holding the vial tightly, nodded in agreement. "Maybe it's just a safer area, maybe they've cleared it out." "It's possible," Rios said, though his voice was laced with skepticism. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The group continued to move forward, but the unease was growing. They passed abandoned cars, once full shops, and empty streets. Not a single infected. It was too perfect. They had expected the city to be crawling with the undead, and while the quietness was a relief, it was also unnerving. As they rounded a corner, the silhouette of a large compound appeared in the distance. It was surrounded by a high fence, the kind that looked like it was meant to keep something, or someone, inside. The compound was eerily quiet, and the lack of movement inside only added to the foreboding atmosphere. "There it is," the leader of the other survivor group said, his voice low but filled with a strange satisfaction. "The safe zone." Rios studied the compound from a distance. It didn't look like the sanctuary they had hoped for. There were no guards patrolling the area, no signs of life at all. The place seemed dead. "Let's approach cautiously," Rios ordered. "Keep your weapons ready." The group moved forward, sticking to the shadows as they neared the compound. As they approached the gate, Rios felt his heartbeat quicken. They were so close now, just a few more steps, and they could finally hand over the samples, hopefully saving countless lives. But what if this was all a trap? What if the resistance was no more, and this safe zone had been abandoned long ago? "Something's not right," Mendez whispered, clearly reading the situation the same way Rios did. Rios motioned for everyone to stop. He carefully approached the gate, inspecting the area. The gate was unlocked, which was odd for a place that was supposed to be a fortress of safety. The latch creaked as he pulled it open just enough to slip through. They stepped into a large, barren courtyard. The buildings looked dilapidated, their windows shattered, and debris scattered across the ground. There were no signs of life. The air was thick with the smell of rot, but there were no bodies in sight. "This doesn't look like a safe zone," Rios said, his voice grave. "It looks like a graveyard." Before anyone could respond, a low, guttural growl echoed from within one of the buildings. "Get ready!" Rios barked. The team instinctively drew their weapons, and the stranger's shaking hands revealed just how out of his depth he really was. Rios motioned for them to spread out and move silently. The growl grew louder, accompanied by the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. Suddenly, the door to the building slammed open, and out stumbled a haggard figure, someone wearing the tattered remnants of a military uniform. His eyes were vacant, his movements jerky and unnatural. Behind him, another figure appeared, and then another. They were all survivors, once, but now they were part of the infected, turned into monstrous, mindless shells of the people they had once been. They're not the resistance," Thomas shouted in disbelief. "They were." The words were cut off as the infected charged, their movements frenzied and desperate. The first figure lunged directly at Rios, its hands outstretched, its eyes wild with madness. Rios acted fast, sidestepping the creature and delivering a quick, efficient strike to the back of its skull with his weapon. The creature crumpled to the ground. He barely had time to register what was happening before the second one came at him from the left. "Behind you!" Mendez yelled, but Rios already saw it, a third figure stumbling out of the shadows, its twisted grin making his skin crawl. Rios's mind raced. They were surrounded. The gate they had entered through was now too far behind them, and there were more infected emerging from the buildings. It was an ambush, no resistance, no safe zone, just another trap set to lure in the desperate and the unprepared. "Fight back!" Rios shouted. "Don't let them overwhelm you." Chaos erupted. Gunshots rang out as the group fought back, but the infected were relentless. Every time they managed to take one down, another seemed to take its place. Rios fired at one creature, only to see another come up from behind. "Keep moving!" Rios ordered, grabbing the man with the rifle and pushing him toward the far side of the compound. "We need to get out of here, now!" Thomas and Mendez were right behind him, covering their retreat as they fought their way through the mass of infected. But Rios knew they couldn't keep this up forever. They needed to escape, and fast. "Let me know if you'd like me to continue with the final part." The group fought with everything they had, but the odds were rapidly stacking against them. Rios's muscles burned, his lungs ached with every breath, and the sound of snarling, tearing, and gunfire filled his ears, drowning out everything else. It was a nightmare made real, and he had no idea how much longer they could last. "Over here!" Thomas yelled, pointing to a broken-down truck at the far end of the compound. The truck was their only chance. If they could reach it, they might be able to barricade themselves inside, at least long enough to regroup. "Move!" Rios barked, trying to push the others forward, but they were struggling to hold their ground. Mendez had a gash on his arm, and the stranger was barely holding on, his face pale with fear. But there was no time for hesitation. They had to keep moving or risk being overwhelmed. The group sprinted toward the truck, firing back as best as they could. A couple of infected went down, but there were too many. It felt like the entire compound had come to life, each corner hiding another group of these monstrous, once human creatures. Their desperate chase was becoming a losing battle. "Go, go, go!" Rios urged, pushing the stranger ahead of him. They reached the truck, and Rios slammed the door open. He shoved Mendez and Thomas inside first, then the stranger. As soon as they were in, Rios turned to close the door, but he was too late. A snarling infected figure lunged at him, grabbing hold of his arm. The force of the impact sent him to the ground, and for a moment, everything went black. But Rios wasn't done yet. With a guttural roar, he pushed the infected off of him, using every ounce of strength left to kick the creature away. It tumbled backward but quickly scrambled to its feet. Rios grabbed his weapon and fired, hitting the creature square in the skull. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline rushing through his veins. He wasn't sure how long he could keep this up, but right now, there was no other choice. He turned toward the truck, ready to jump in, but that's when the second wave hit. Several more infected appeared from the shadows, drawn by the noise and chaos. Rios looked back at his team. Mendez, Thomas, and the stranger were all inside the truck, trying to get the engine started. "Start the engine!" Rios shouted, his voice hoarse. "Now!" But the truck wouldn't start. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then died, leaving them stranded in the middle of a horde. He turned back to face the infected, 6, maybe 7 now, and he could feel the cold sweat on his neck as they closed in. Rios could see the fear in their eyes, but he couldn't let it show. Not now. Not when they were so close. "Rios!" Mendez yelled from inside the truck. "Come on, we need you." With one final, desperate look at his team, Rios gritted his teeth, There was only one thing left to do. He pulled the last of the prototype weapon from his belt, something he'd been saving as a last resort. The vial of samples they had carried so far. He broke it open and poured its contents onto the ground. The effect was instantaneous. The air around him began to shimmer, and the infected stopped in their tracks. They froze as if caught in a time loop, their twisted, monstrous forms locked in place. Rios didn't wait. He bolted for the truck, leaping inside just as the engine roared to life. They were safe, for now. Did it work? The stranger asked, his voice trembling. Rios slumped into the seat, catching his breath. I don't know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But we've bought ourselves some time. The truck sped off, leaving the compound, and the infected, behind. For the first time in hours, Rios allowed himself to relax just a little. The silence was deafening, but it was a welcome change from the chaos they'd just escaped. As the truck made its way through the broken streets, Rios thought about what they had discovered. The samples, the prototype weapon, and what it could mean for the world. They still had so much to learn, but one thing was clear, there was hope. The infection might not be unstoppable after all. Do you think the resistance is still out there? Thomas asked, breaking the silence. I don't know, Rios replied, staring out the window at the desolate city. But we're going to find them. And when we do, we're going to make sure this nightmare ends. With the vehicle moving into the unknown, the team knew that their journey was far from over. But with the knowledge they carried and the determination in their hearts, they felt a glimmer of hope. This was just the beginning. And with that, their fight against the infection had only begun.